Millionaire pretends to be blind to test the little beggar. What she does leaves him speechless. Leave your like to follow the upcoming videos, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this. The clock struck 10 p.m. when Andres Velasco closed the door to his office, ending yet another day identical to the previous one. The man, middle-aged with tired eyes, wore an impeccable suit, as always. His hands held a briefcase filled with important documents, but his mind was far away. Owner of an enviable fortune, Andres had everything many dreamed of: luxurious cars, properties around the world, and a well-established company. But deep down, none of that filled the emptiness he had felt for years. His life had become a series of predictable commitments, where silence and solitude were his only companions at the end of each day. Almost a decade ago, a car accident took the lives of the two people he loved most, his wife and his daughter. Since then, he had thrown himself into work, becoming a machine of rational and strategic decisions. Friends? He had none left. Family? Only distant relatives he didn't care about. It was as if, over time, Andres had unlearned how to feel. Everything around him was calculated, predictable, and without surprises. His only pleasure was the absolute control over his company, for in every other part of his life, he had already lost any sense of mastery. That night, instead of calling his driver to pick him up, Andres decided to walk a few blocks before going home. It was a rare habit, one he allowed himself once in a while just to remind himself that he was still alive. The city streets were busy, full of cars, lights, and voices mingling in the urban chaos. He walked among the passers-by without really seeing them. His mind was far away, lost in thoughts of numbers, investments, and contracts. But upon turning a corner, something caught his attention. Sitting on the sidewalk, against a streetlight, a little girl with a fragile appearance huddled to protect herself from the cold. She wore dirty, faded clothes, and her feet were bare on the cold concrete. In front of her lay a paper cup with a few coins scattered in disarray. Her gaze asked for nothing. She simply observed the movement around her, as if she had already accepted her fate. Something about the scene disturbed Andres. He had never stopped to really notice the invisible people of the city, the beggars, the street children, those who struggled to survive one day at a time. For a moment he hesitated. The natural impulse would have been to move on, to ignore her like any other problem that didn't involve his company. But at that moment, something inside him prevented him. It wasn't compassion nor pity. It was a strange discomfort, a feeling he couldn't name. Without knowing why, his steps slowed, and his mind began to formulate a thought that would change everything. What if I tested this girl? Without understanding where this idea came from, Andres took a deep breath and decided to act. Andres stopped a few meters from the girl, discreetly observing her. Something about her intrigued him, though he couldn't exactly explain what it was. Perhaps it was her distant gaze, or the way she hugged her own legs as if trying to disappear in the midst of that indifferent city. He knew there were thousands of children on the streets, but for some reason, that one in particular made him hesitate. His rational instinct told him to move on, forget about her, and return to the comfort of his home. However, for the first time in years, he ignored logic and decided to do something he had never done before: get involved. An idea formed in his mind almost instantly. He wanted to test that girl. He didn't know exactly why, but he wanted to see how she would react to an unexpected situation. Then, subtly, he pretended to stumble and let his wallet fall to the ground. High-value bills spilled out when the wallet hit the pavement, scattering across the concrete. For a moment, the city's noise seemed to dissipate as he waited to see what the girl would do. She looked at the bills for a few seconds without showing any immediate reaction. Andres remained still, pretending not to have noticed anything. Anyone else might have quickly stooped to pick up the money and disappear into the crowd. After all, a street child, hungry and cold, would have every reason in the world to do so. But instead, the girl hesitated. Her small fingers touched the wallet, feeling the texture of the fine leather. Her eyes alternated between the money and the man before her. And then, as if she had made a firm decision, she picked up the wallet gently, stood up, and walked toward him. "Sir, your wallet fell," she said in a weak voice but full of honesty. Andres was paralyzed. It wasn't the response he expected. It wasn't the behavior that logic told him should happen. He took the wallet back without saying a word, just staring into those big eyes that, even though tired, carried an innocence he no longer believed existed in the world. His testing plan had gone completely different from what he anticipated. For a moment, he felt ridiculous. Who was he to test that girl? What kind of person had he become to the point of using someone as an experiment? Yet, at the same time, he felt something break inside him. Something that, until that moment, had been buried under years of coldness and indifference. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. He couldn't simply turn his back and continue on his way. Andres took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. No matter how hard he tried to maintain his composure, he couldn't ignore the little one before him, holding a cup with a few coins, with dirty feet and eyes that seemed much older than they should be. He had never cared about people like her. His life had always been surrounded by influential people, meetings in luxurious rooms, and decisions that moved millions. But somehow, at that moment, his entire reality was reduced to a single question. What is this girl doing alone on the street? He knelt down to be at her level, a gesture that seemed to surprise her. "What is your name?" he asked, without thinking twice. The girl pressed her lips together, hesitant. It was evident she didn't trust him. And why would she? Andres represented exactly the kind of person who never looked at someone like her. After a few seconds of uncomfortable silence, she finally answered in a soft voice, "Valeria." The name echoed in Andres's mind, as if it held some greater meaning than he could comprehend at that moment. "Are you alone here?" he continued, trying not to sound intrusive. Valeria nodded but looked away, as if she didn't want to go into details. Andres felt a lump in his throat. He was not a sentimental man. He didn't usually let himself be carried away by sad stories. Yet something in the resigned coldness of the girl disturbed him deeply. It wasn't despair, nor begging. It was acceptance. The way she seemed to have already understood that no one would come to help her, that the world would continue on without caring about her existence. He looked at the wallet in his hands. He knew he could simply give her a handful of money and move on. It was what anyone else would do, and probably what he himself would have done on any other day. But something was different. Andres felt an inexplicable impulse to do more. "Have you had dinner?" he asked, not quite knowing why. Valeria frowned, surprised. Apparently, she didn't expect a stranger to ask something so simple. After a brief silence, she shook her head. That was when Andres made the decision that would change everything. "Come on then. I'll take you to get something to eat." As soon as he said the words, he realized how unusual that was for him. He had never done anything like this before. He had never deviated from his routine for someone who wasn't a strategic piece in his professional life. But, for the first time in years, he was about to do something without any exact logic, just because he felt he needed to. Valeria hesitated. She looked at Andres with distrust, as if trying to understand his intentions. A well-dressed man with a serious look, offering her food without asking for anything in return. It was not common in her reality. She had learned from an early age that nothing was given for free. There was always a price. Yet, at the same time, hunger was pressing, and that stranger did not seem threatening. On the contrary, he was there, standing, patiently waiting for her answer. Noticing the doubt in the girl's eyes, Andres decided to take a step back. Perhaps he was pushing too hard. Perhaps she had already learned not to trust adults. "Don't worry. I just want to give you something to eat," he said in the calmest voice he could muster. Valeria looked around as if searching for an escape. She wasn't used to kindness, but her stomach rumbled softly and necessity spoke louder. She nodded slowly, as if still unsure she was making the right decision. Andres motioned for her to follow him as he walked toward a small restaurant on the corner. The place was simple but clean, and it seemed far removed from the world Valeria knew. As soon as they entered, the girl shrugged, uncomfortable. She sat in the chair as if expecting someone to order her out at any moment. Andres picked up the menu and handed it to her. "Choose whatever you want." Valeria didn't touch the menu. Instead, she looked at him and asked softly, "Are you helping me because you want to, or because you feel sorry for me?" The question caught Andres by surprise. He had never imagined that a child would have that perception, but he also knew that his answer mattered. I'm helping you because I want to, he said sincerely. Because I believe no one should sleep hungry. Valeria studied his face for a few seconds, as if deciding whether to believe him. Then she picked up the menu and pointed to a simple dish without saying another word. Andres placed the order for her, and for the first time that night, he realized that this girl was not just another street child. She was someone who had learned to survive on her own, someone who already knew that the world was not a kind place. But what he didn't yet know was that that night would completely change his own life. Dinner took place in a strange silence. Valeria ate slowly, as if she couldn't believe that this meal was truly for her. Her furtive eyes scanned the restaurant, watching the customers and staff, always alert, as if expecting someone to come and send her away. Andres, for his part, observed her discreetly, noting every little detail. That girl was not just any street child. There was something about her that made him want to understand more, something that stirred him in an unexpected way. While she chewed, he casually asked, "How long have you been on the street?" Valeria didn't answer immediately. She finished swallowing a piece of bread that accompanied her meal and simply shrugged. "Since my grandmother died," she said almost in a whisper. The answer was simple, but its weight fell like a stone on Andres's chest. He asked no further questions. He didn't want to pressure her, but now he knew that the girl had no one. Gradually, Valeria relaxed. Her hunger was sated, and the tension in her shoulders lessened a bit. Still distrustful, but now less withdrawn, she began to answer Andres's questions in slightly longer phrases. She said she used to sleep near an abandoned building, that she already knew which trash cans held food that wasn't completely spoiled, and that she avoided adults because most of them are no good. He gulped upon hearing that. It was not something a child should know. When they finished eating, Andres paid the bill and fell silent for a moment. His logic told him that the right thing to do was simply let her go. He had done his part. But something inside him refused to accept that idea. He looked at Valeria, who had returned to her defensive posture, as if expecting him to lecture her or try to send her to some shelter. But Andres did something different. "It's late, and it's going to get even colder," he said calmly. "You can spend the night at my house. Tomorrow we'll decide what to do." The girl's eyes widened. He noticed her immediate hesitation. It was natural. Valeria was used to adults wanting something in return, to dangerous situations disguised as good intentions. "No tricks, no obligations. Just a warm bed and a roof for tonight," he added. Valeria bit her lip, thoughtful. Then she took a deep breath and nodded. Andres didn't know why he was doing this. He only knew that, for the first time in a long time, he felt he was doing the right thing. The journey to Andres's house was silent. Valeria entered the car hesitantly, curling up in the back seat as if ready to jump and flee at any moment. Her watchful eyes scanned the surroundings, evaluating whether there was a trap. Andres noticed her defensive posture but said nothing. He simply drove in silence, respecting the girl's space. He knew that trust wouldn't come quickly. When they arrived at the mansion, Valeria was paralyzed for a moment. The automatic gates opened, revealing an immaculate garden and an imposing house with wide windows and warm lighting. It looked as if it belonged to a completely different world from hers. She hesitated before getting out of the car, her gaze wavering between the house's door and Andres, as if waiting for him to change his mind. "You can come in whenever you want," he said naturally, walking ahead. Stepping into the house, Valeria felt a mix of fascination and discomfort. The floor shone, the furniture was expensive, and everything was perfectly arranged. Yet there was something strange about this place. It was too big, too silent. "It looks like a museum," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Andres smiled slightly. He couldn't disagree. Since the death of his family, the house had become nothing more than a luxurious, lifeless space. He led her to one of the guest rooms. It was a comfortable room, with a large bed, clean sheets, and even a desk with books. Valeria stood in the doorway, not knowing how to react. "The bathroom is over there," Andres indicated. "There are towels and clothes that might be useful for you." She didn't answer immediately. Her body was still tense, as if expecting a trick. "You can lock the door if you want," he added. "No one will disturb you." The girl nodded, finally crossing the threshold of the room. Andres watched her for a few seconds before stepping away. He felt a strange weight in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. genuine concern. He didn't know what was happening to him, but one thing was clear. Valeria wasn't just any street child. And now that she was here, he felt that his life was about to change, even if he didn't yet understand how. That night, Andres took a long time to fall asleep. His mind was restless, and he found himself listening to the small sounds coming from the corridor where Valeria was. He had never brought someone into his house without a logical reason. He didn't like surprises, much less unexpected changes. But somehow, that girl had broken through his barriers without him even noticing. The silence of the mansion, once comforting, now seemed oppressive. For the first time in years, he felt that there was someone there who needed him. In the guest room, Valeria also couldn't sleep. The mattress was too soft, the sheets too perfumed. She was used to the cold concrete, the noise of cars, the smell of the street. Being here, in such a clean and safe place, made her feel suspicious. Could she really stay? Would he simply say in the morning that it was a mistake and send her away? That was the reality she knew. People always left, sooner or later. In the morning, Andres went down to the kitchen, and without much thought, began preparing coffee. He had never been the type to cook. He always had employees for that. But for some reason, he felt he should do something simple for Valeria. He prepared bread with butter, juice, and coffee. The aroma spread throughout the house, and soon he heard timid footsteps approaching. When he turned, he saw the girl standing at the entrance of the kitchen, still wearing the clothes he had left for her. "Good morning," said Andres, trying to sound natural. Valeria didn't answer immediately. Her eyes fell on the set table, and he realized she was surprised. "Are you hungry?" She nodded slowly. He motioned toward a chair, and the girl sat down, still hesitant. She took the bread with both hands and ate slowly, as if she didn't want to appear too eager. Andres observed every detail. It wasn't just physical hunger affecting her. It was the fear that this moment of stability was only temporary. As they ate, the silence began to break. Andres asked if she had slept well, and Valeria shrugged. "I'm not used to big beds," she murmured. He smiled slightly. He hadn't thought of that. For him, comfort was obvious, but for Valeria, it was something strange. For the first time, Andres realized that his house, despite its luxury, had never really been a home. And now, with that girl here, he began to see things differently. The routine in the house began to change. Before, Andres spent most of his time alone, surrounded only by the noise of his phone notifications and endless meetings. Now there were light footsteps echoing in the corridor, small voices murmuring curiosities, and even a presence he didn't know he would miss when it was gone. Valeria, still cautious, gradually explored the environment, as if testing the limits of how long she could stay without being expelled. She never asked direct questions, but she observed everything carefully. She looked at the books on the shelf, the pictures on the walls, and especially the old photographs that Andres still kept. Especially one of them where he appeared next to a light-haired girl, smiling while holding a balloon. "Who is she?" Valeria suddenly asked, catching Andres by surprise. He fell silent for a few seconds before answering. "My daughter." The girl nodded but did not press the matter. Perhaps she felt that this memory carried too much weight to share. Andres, however, felt something different. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken about his daughter, not because he didn't want to, but because he avoided touching the pain. Yet with Valeria here, that photo seemed less distant, not merely a reminder of what he had lost, but also a connection to the present. In the following days, Andres began to notice subtle changes. Valeria, who had always been afraid to relax, started sitting on the sofa instead of merely leaning against the walls. She was less startled by sudden noises and no longer seemed ready to run at the slightest movement. She still spoke little, but there was visible progress. When Andres returned from work, he found signs of her presence. A book out of place, a cup left in the sink, a blanket she had pulled onto the sofa. Small details that indicated she was beginning to feel part of that space. One day, when he entered the kitchen, Andres found a drawing on the table. It was made with colored pencils he didn't even remember having at home. On the paper, there was a big house, 2 figures at the door, and above them, a smiling sun. He looked at the drawing for a long time, feeling something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just a childish scribble. It was a message. Unbeknownst to him, Valeria was beginning to see that place as a home, and more than that, she was starting to see him as part of it. The phone rang in the late afternoon, interrupting Andres's thoughts. On the other end of the line, a formal voice introduced herself. "Mr. Velasco, this is Clara Rodriguez from the Child Protection Department. We received a report about a minor living with you." Andres felt his heart race. He knew that keeping Valeria there without a legal process could raise suspicions, but he never imagined that someone would take the initiative to report him. Clara continued in a bureaucratic yet not aggressive tone. "We need to pay a visit to evaluate the situation. Can you receive us tomorrow afternoon?" Andres took a deep breath before replying, "Of course. I will be available." As soon as he hung up, he spent a few seconds staring into nothingness. Reality hit him like a punch. He had no legal right over Valeria. If the state decided that she should be taken to a shelter, there would be little he could do. Valeria noticed Andres's closed expression as soon as he entered the room. She had always been good at reading people, a survival instinct she had developed on the streets. "Did something happen?" she asked hesitantly. He considered softening the situation, but he knew she had already faced harsh truths too many times. "They are coming here tomorrow. They want to know why you're with me." Valeria stiffened, her fingers tightening the fabric of her blouse. "Are they going to take me away?" Andres knelt before her, maintaining a steady gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, because lying wouldn't help. "But I will do whatever it takes to prevent that." The girl nodded slowly, but the fear in her eyes was evident. She had already been forgotten before. She had heard promises that were never kept. Would this time be any different? That night, the atmosphere in the house was heavy. Valeria had dinner in silence, and Andres felt the weight of something he had never faced before. The fear of losing someone again. He knew he couldn't simply say he wanted to take care of her. The system didn't work that way. He would have to prove that he could offer a safe environment, that he was a reliable person, not merely making an impulsive decision. But deep down, he knew the truth. Valeria was already part of his life, and losing that connection now would be like losing everything he had tried to protect, all over again. The next day dawned heavy with tension. Andres spent the morning reorganizing the house, trying to ensure everything looked adequate for the visit of the Child Protection Department. He knew it wasn't just a matter of appearance. He wanted to demonstrate that Valeria was in a safe, clean, and structured environment. However, as much as he tried to focus on the details, anxiety would not let him rest. Valeria, for her part, was even quieter than usual. Sitting on the sofa, she hugged her knees to her chest, as if preparing herself for the worst. Andres felt a tightening in his chest seeing her like that. It wasn't fair that a child had to carry so much fear and uncertainty. He approached and sat beside her. "It will be all right," he said, not really knowing if it was true. Valeria didn't answer immediately. "And if they take me away?" she whispered, finally breaking the silence. Andres took a deep breath. He wanted to say that it wouldn't happen, but he knew he didn't have that control. Instead, he answered sincerely, "If it happens, I won't give up on you." The girl's eyes met his, full of both doubt and hope. Valeria wasn't used to promises. She had heard many, and most had never been fulfilled. Yet something in the way Andres spoke made her want to believe, even if she wasn't sure. At 3 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. Andres slowly rose and walked to the door. When he opened it, he found a professionally dressed woman holding a clipboard with an evaluative look. "Mr. Velasco, I'm Clara Rodriguez from the Child Protection Department." He nodded and invited her in. Valeria remained motionless on the sofa, her body tense. "This is Valeria," Andres said, trying to sound natural. Clara smiled at the girl, but she did not reciprocate. Her gaze was fixed on the floor. The interview began with formal questions. Clara wanted to know how long Valeria had been at the house, how Andres had found her, and what his intentions were regarding her. He answered honestly, explaining that he couldn't simply ignore her, that he wanted to ensure she had a safe place. "And you, Valeria?" Clara asked gently. "How do you feel here?" The girl slowly raised her head, her fingers clenching the fabric of her pants as if seeking comfort. "I feel safe here," she said, her voice firmer than Andres had expected. "I want to stay." Clara noted down Valeria's words with a neutral expression, though Andres could tell she was truly listening. After a few questions about the girl's routine in the house, Clara began to explain the next steps. I understand your concern and your intention to help, Mr. Velasco, but there is a process to be followed. The law requires that any minor without legal guardianship be placed under the state's protection until a definitive solution is found. Andres felt his stomach churn. He had expected this, but hearing it out loud made everything even more real. Valeria, sitting beside him, stiffened. Does that mean they're going to take me away? Her voice was low, but filled with fear. Clara adjusted her glasses and replied professionally, Not immediately. We need to evaluate the case before making any decision, but it is a possibility. Andres felt a surge of protectiveness. And if I want to keep her? And if I want to assume legal responsibility? Clara looked at him intently. We would have to initiate a formal guardianship or adoption process, which could take time. In the meantime, the decision does not rest solely with us. As soon as Clara left, leaving Andres with a pile of doubts and documents to fill out, Valeria huddled on the sofa. She didn't cry, but he sensed the panic hidden in her silence. He sat beside her, feeling a helplessness he had never known before. For years, Andres had always had absolute control over his life. Contracts, investments, business mergers. But now, the most important thing in his life was beyond his grasp. I will fight for you, he said bluntly. I don't know what will happen, but I won't leave you alone. Valeria hesitated before speaking. And if they say I have to go? Andres looked into her eyes. Then I'll find a way to bring you back. He wasn't sure he could keep that promise, but it was all he could offer at that moment. From that day on, Andres dove into the legal process. He hired a specialized lawyer, gathered documents, and prepared statements. Each passing day was a challenge, a battle against a bureaucratic system that didn't value immediate emotional bonds. But he knew one thing. Valeria was already part of his life, and he wasn't willing to give her up. The days that followed were a mix of uncertainty and adjustment. While Andres devoted himself to the legal procedures to try to ensure that Valeria could stay with him, the girl gradually began to feel that this place was hers. Yet insecurity still lingered. At any moment, everything could change. That feeling of instability kept her from completely relaxing. She had learned that happiness, when it came, was always fleeting. To keep her mind away from anxiety, Valeria began exploring the house more. She took a liking to Andres's library, where she would run her fingers over the books, admiring the covers even though she couldn't read well. One afternoon, he found her sitting on the floor, flipping through a children's book. Do you like stories? He asked, pulling up a chair to sit next to her. Valeria shrugged. I do, but I never really learned to read properly. Andres was surprised. It seemed obvious, yet he had never stopped to consider it. That night, he made a decision. He brought a book with large print and sat next to her on the sofa. If you want, I can teach you. At first, Valeria looked at him with distrust, but after a few seconds she pulled the book closer and nodded, and so a new habit began. Every night, before sleep, they spent a few minutes reading together. At first, Valeria mispronounced many words, but she didn't give up. And for the first time, Andres felt something different, pride. Meanwhile, the legal process moved slowly. Andres's lawyer explained that to obtain guardianship, he would have to demonstrate not only that he could financially provide for Valeria, but also that there was an emotional bond between them. The problem was that the state did not see feelings as concrete proof. What mattered were documents, expert opinions, and established rules. Andres began to realize that it wouldn't be as simple as he thought. Despite the uncertainties, one thing was undeniable. Valeria was already part of his life. When Andres returned from work, he no longer found a silent, empty house. Now there was a girl sitting on the sofa, scribbling drawings or trying to read. Sometimes she showed him new progress in her reading, and he smiled, encouraging her. Gradually her fear diminished, but both knew that nothing was yet definitive. The clock was ticking, and the final decision was not in their hands. The day of the hearing arrived sooner than Andres expected. Ever since he had initiated the process to obtain guardianship of Valeria, each day felt like a race against time. He knew he had done everything he could, gathered documents, proven his financial stability, demonstrated his commitment. But none of that guaranteed a favorable decision. Deep down, he feared that all his efforts might not be enough. That morning, Valeria was quieter than ever. She wore the new clothes Andres had bought for the hearing, but kept her eyes lowered, nervously fidgeting with her fingers. Andres noticed her restlessness. "It will be all right," he said, though he wasn't sure himself. "You just need to tell the truth." The girl nodded, yet her expression still carried a weight he couldn't ease. In court, the atmosphere was cold and formal. The judge, a middle-aged man with attentive eyes, opened the session. Andres's lawyer presented the documents and explained the guardianship request. Then, Clara Rodriguez, the social worker who had visited the house, read her report. "Valeria appears to be well cared for and shows a strong attachment to Mr. Velasco," she stated. "However, the process requires that we evaluate all options before reaching a definitive decision." Then the judge turned to Valeria. "Can you tell me, in your own words, how you feel living with Mr. Velasco?" The girl swallowed hard. Andres felt his heart race. He knew that this moment was crucial. Valeria hesitated, looked at him, then at the judge. Finally, she took a deep breath and said in a firm voice, "I don't want to leave. This is my home." The judge maintained a neutral expression but then asked, "Why?" Valeria clasped her hands in her lap and replied without averting her gaze, "Because no one has ever taken care of me like he does. Because now I'm not afraid when it gets dark. Because he teaches me things I've never learned. And because for the first time, I feel that I'm important to someone." Andres closed his eyes for a brief moment. He knew that, whatever the judge's decision, that moment had already changed everything. The judge fell silent for a few moments after hearing her words. The courtroom felt charged with tension, and Andres felt the weight of the moment. He knew that merely wanting to care for her wasn't enough. The system had its own rules, and he was at its mercy, a decision that could change everything. His heart raced as he awaited the final verdict. After reviewing some documents and exchanging glances with Clara Rodriguez, the judge leaned forward slightly and began to speak. "The situation presented is atypical, but the reports indicate that the minor is in a safe and healthy environment. However, adoption is a lengthy process, and we must ensure that all procedures are followed correctly." Andres held his breath, fearing he was about to hear a "but," which terrified him. Given the evident emotional bond and the stability demonstrated by Mr. Velasco, I grant temporary custody of Valeria while the adoption process is formalized. Andres felt such intense relief that he had to lean on the table for a moment. Valeria's eyes widened, and it took her a few seconds to understand what that meant. "Does that mean I can stay?" she asked, almost inaudibly. The judge nodded. "For now, yes. But we will continue monitoring the case until a definitive decision is reached." Valeria looked at Andres, seeking confirmation. He smiled, a rare sight on his face, and nodded. Without thinking twice, the girl threw herself into his arms, clinging as if she could finally breathe. Andres felt the small figure trembling against his chest and knew that, regardless of the next steps, he would never allow them to be separated. Upon leaving the courtroom, Clara Rodriguez approached and said in a professional tone with a slight smile, "You've gained time, Mr. Velasco. Now you need to prove that you're ready to be a father." Andres didn't hesitate before replying, "I already am." And in that moment, he knew that was the only truth that mattered. The journey back home was different from any moment Andres had experienced in recent years. This time, he wasn't alone in the car, lost in thoughts about business or corporate strategies. Seated beside him, Valeria gazed out the window, but her expression was different. For the first time, there was something akin to relief in her eyes. She still didn't smile completely, but it seemed she believed that, at least for a while, she wouldn't have to run away anymore. When they arrived at the mansion, Valeria hesitated for a moment before entering. Andres noticed and, without saying a word, waited. Then, she took a deep breath and crossed the threshold, as if sealing that new beginning once and for all. "What do you want to do now?" Andres asked, trying to break the solemn moment. Valeria smiled shyly. "Can I choose anything?" he prompted. She thought for a few seconds and, to his surprise, replied, "I want to cook something, but I don't know how to cook." Andres laughed and led her to the kitchen. Together they improvised a recipe, which ended up as a complete mess of flour, laughter, and ingredients scattered across the counter. For the first time, The house felt full of life. Before going to sleep, Valeria stopped at the door of Andres's room. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said in a low tone, yet full of meaning. Andres looked at her and smiled. "You'll never have to worry about that again." This time, Valeria believed him. That night, Andres took the photo of his deceased daughter, and instead of feeling only sadness, felt gratitude. He knew that Sophia would always have a place in his heart, but now he understood that love need not have limits. Valeria wasn't a replacement. She was a new beginning, and he wouldn't allow anything to separate them again. The days that followed were unlike anything Andres had ever experienced. He, who for years had closed himself off to any form of emotional bond, now found meaning in the little things. In Valeria's morning greetings, in the drawings she left scattered around the house, in the sound of laughter echoing in a home that had once been nothing more than an empty space. Unbeknownst to him, he had transformed. And so had Valeria. She no longer slept in fear, nor did she huddle at the slightest sign of uncertainty. Now, she made plans. She asked what they would do on the weekend, what book they would read at night, what the future might hold. Andres realized that this was the greatest gift he could have given her, the freedom to imagine a tomorrow. For someone who had spent so long believing she had no place in the world, that was true victory. One day, while organizing some documents, Andres found a drawing by Valeria that he didn't remember having seen before. In it, there were 3 figures holding hands: him, Valeria, and a light-haired girl. Above, a blue sky, and in the corner, a radiant sun. His chest tightened. "Who is this?" he asked, calling to Valeria. She looked at the drawing and replied naturally, "It's Sophia." Andres was speechless. He had never spoken much about his deceased daughter. There were no photos of her in the house, except those kept in his office. "How do you know what she looked like?" Valeria shrugged. "I just felt that she should be in the drawing too." Andres clutched the paper, feeling a shiver run down his body. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. Perhaps it was merely the imagination of a child. But deep down, he knew there was something much greater behind it all. He looked at Valeria, who now called him Dad, without hesitation, and realized that some things don't require explanation. Fate, time, life, whatever force had brought them together, he knew he would never let them be separated again. And in that moment, Andres understood that it wasn't he who had saved Valeria. It was she who had rescued him. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs this message of hope. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of overcoming and courage. Join our community to be moved by real stories of strength and transformation.